Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Buff Naggle the Podcast, where we explore entertaining and enlightening discussions of the adventure of life and all things good. From science and technology to history and philosophy to leadership and success. We hope to give you a better understanding of the world and skills for everyone to pursue their own adventure.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Buff Naggle the Podcast, where we talk about all things good in the pursuit of the adventure of life. I am Rafe, and we're doing a special episode today. I have to tell you that because this was not in the original. This is a highly thought after, let's say, a very rich production environment here at the Buff, and we plan these things out, but we've altered the schedule because some things have happened, and we want to get to them. But of course, you guys know, because you are the world's greatest listeners and have made us a top 10% podcast, that you're the world's greatest listeners. And you can reach us, as usual, at buffnaggle@buffnaggle.com. Share the love, share the buff, give us a 5-star review. Hey, you know all these things, all right? Just do them. That's what we need you to do, is do the things you're supposed to do. Tell a friend to listen, and you will get a free episode. And somewhere buried in the show notes is a place where you could buy me a coffee. And one person that has actually bought me a coffee in the past, a real honest to goodness coffee, is our guest today, none other than America's favorite rocket scientist and big brain smarthead, Bob Luzenski. Bob, thanks for coming on outside of our normal scheduled plan to discuss an adventurous week in human space flight.
Yes, it's been a very interesting week in NASA human space flight, and I jumped at the chance when you asked if I wanted to do another podcast episode. I jumped at the chance since there's plenty to talk about.
All right. So you and I have been trading some little messages back and forth about the goings on. I'm going to say the goings on with the Artemis launch. The last time we talked here on the show was 4 or 5 weeks ago.
It was like 3 weeks ago.
Only 3 weeks ago? Okay.
Yes.
Wow. And we were very excited because Artemis was going to be launching and sending some people around the far side of the moon. And that didn't happen in that time frame. There were some things that went awry a little bit. Not on, these things happen. This is a hard thing to do. But we wanted to get back and talk about all these things that have happened. And you have kind of laid this out in a plan. So let's start with that update on where are we with the Artemis II mission.
That sounds good. And yes, I laid out a plan so that we could hopefully reach all these topics today, because there's a lot to talk about. So it was a big week in human spaceflight news. Actually, I think there was also a crew launch to the International Space Center, or Space Station, that I think is within the past week. It's hard to keep up with all this, actually, even for me, who's retired. But the big news, first thing we want to talk about is the Artemis II. 3 weeks ago in the episode we recorded then, we were just potentially a week away from the Artemis II launch. One of the things we didn't talk about at that time was what were the remaining few items that we talked about the flight, the plan, contrasted it with the Apollo missions. But one of the things we didn't talk about was a major test that needed to pass, that they were planning on conducting a few days after, actually the Monday following when we recorded, which ironically was the day before that previous episode released, and made some of what we talked about obsolete before the episode even released. So that major test was the wet dress rehearsal. So back in the days when I worked at the Space Center, the Kennedy Space Center on the shuttle, we used to refer to it as the countdown demonstration test, but now it's referred to as a dress rehearsal. And this was a wet dress rehearsal, which means that it included loading propellants onto the launch vehicle, and basically doing the full countdown to make sure that the vehicle was ready to launch.
So they're going to do in a wet rehearsal, the wet refers to, well, to fuel and
propellants, both the fuel and the oxidizer.
Right. So those things have to, so they actually they load the thing with everything that they're going to need for the launch, including you fill up all the, you fill the gas tank is really what you do.
Yes.
And you have to do that very carefully because these propellants, well, it's not like pumping gas where you can stand there. I've seen people do this. I don't advocate this. I've seen people do that while smoking cigarettes, and this is not that kind of thing. This is high tech, very well controlled stuff. And it's not just dangerous. It's just really difficult to do if you don't do it right. If you do it right, it's difficult.
Yes, it can be hard to do. And we can get into that here in a moment. But basically, wet dress rehearsal was the final major test. It exercised all of the vehicle ahead of actually committing to do the launch countdown. And the plan was for that to be it ended up being, I think, about 4 or 5 days before the planned launch at that time. And what happened was one of our least favorite problems recurred. On Artemis I, the uncrewed mission, the first flight of the Artemis in the Space Launch System rocket, we had hydrogen leaks, and it caused a lot of problems. It took months to get it right and get the vehicle loaded and get a successful wet dress rehearsal. And it eventually, we even had a launch countdown scrub, but eventually they got off. But it took better part of a year to do. And
that was the Artemis I.
That was Artemis I. So Artemis II, they had a very, I'm going to say, success-oriented plan to do a wet dress rehearsal 4 or 5 days before the planned launch. And now you have this launch window that is only 5 or 6 days long to get to the moon, under the right circumstances and return. And so it was very success oriented to do this test a few days before launch, then analyze the results and then go. So it didn't go well. They had difficulty loading the vehicle with liquid hydrogen. And they ran behind on their timeline. They would have missed the 2-hour launch window if they had tried to launch, if there was actually a launch countdown instead of a dress rehearsal. And it just was very difficult.
So we're talking about I said the fuel, but it's not the fuel. You also have to bring an oxidizer up there with you because there's no air in space, as we all know, right? So you have to bring something to allow that stuff to burn. And so you have to load essentially oxygen and hydrogen into this thing. And it's not just like, there's if you go to your favorite fast food restaurant, they bring tanks of carbon dioxide in there to run the soda machine. And that's, guys hook that up and do that all the time. This is substantially more complicated than that because, well, there's a lot of hydrogen. Hydrogen's substantially more dangerous and it's really cold.
It's really cold, and the hydrogen molecule itself is quite small. It is as small as it gets for molecules.
Yep.
And it likes to find ways to get out. And it's used as a rocket fuel because it is the reaction with oxygen is very energetic and very efficient. And that's why it's used as a rocket fuel. But the downside is it's difficult to handle liquid hydrogen. It's about as cold as it gets, short of absolute zero. It's like minus 423 or something like that.
Okay, so that's really
Fahrenheit.
Cold. Okay,
yes, it's quite
yes.
cold, and so it's a difficult substance to work with, but it has benefits, and that's why it's used. And so it's a challenge, and The shuttle used liquid hydrogen for the fuel on for the space shuttle main engines, and they had times where they struggled with it. They weren't loading as much of it as the Space Launch System rocket is loading, and that may be part of it. But it's a challenge.
So you can't pump it like you pump gas, right? I mean, you don't squeeze the trigger and the stuff comes out, right? So how do they do that so that it, like,
there are valves?
What causes the problem? I guess
yes, that's actually a really good question. It's a quick disconnect interface. So there's an interface on the rocket side, okay, and there's an interface on the ground side. And what makes this even harder than just, hey, I want to pump liquid hydrogen from this tank to this tank, okay, is that connection has to separate cleanly and quickly at T-0 when the rocket decides to go. And so that adds an additional layer of challenges to the engineering and the use of this fuel. And so it just makes it that much harder. And so on wet dress rehearsal 1, we had leaks again. They were outside the limits that NASA had established for leaks in the area of the connection between the ground side and the rocket. And so they had to give up their plans to launch in February, and they had to step back, and they set up platforms at the launch pad to gain access to this interface. They opened the interface up, they inspected it, they removed the seals that were in place, they put in new seals, they checked some other things, put it back together, and did a test where they encountered, this was not a full wet dress rehearsal, but it was a fueling test to check out to make sure that those problems, the fueling problems, were solved. They encountered an additional problem where they had a filter clog, so they had to check the filter. This was on the ground side, and when they checked the filter, there was nothing in the filter, but the conclusion they had was that there was potential ice buildup, which, if you think about it, when it's really cold, pumping the liquid hydrogen, if there's any moisture in there, you have the potential to get, water ice. And then if you then thaw that so you can open it up to gain access to it, it's going to go away. So, yeah. And that's what they found. But they talked to some other folks from one of the other rocket companies who gave them some advice on that. And so they replaced the filter, and they went ahead and they did, this past week, starting Tuesday, they started a wet dress rehearsal 2.
Okay.
And that proceeded much better than wet dress rehearsal 1 in basically all aspects, except for one, which I want to touch on. But wet dress rehearsal 2, loading propellants on the vehicle, both the liquid oxygen and the liquid hydrogen, went very well. The leak rate on the liquid hydrogen was way down to on the order of 1% to 1.5%. It was significantly below their prior more tight constraints that they had on Artemis 1, which they then relaxed in Artemis 2.
So there is a leak rate. Okay, it's not. So you always, I guess we tend to think.
Well, like actually,
the leak rate should be 0, right? But
it's not the leak rate; it's the concentration of hydrogen. When I said 1%, it's concentration of hydrogen within the cavity around the connections to the rocket to carry the fuel.
All right. So and when they replace this, the seals are these? Can we think of these like gaskets, like little rubber things?
Yeah,
is that how we should think about them?
Exactly how you should think about them. I think they're round. I think they might have. I saw something that said they were at least partially Teflon. I don't know the exact composition, but they're basically seals.
And how big are these pipes? Are these like, because I used to work at the gas station.
8-inch and 4-inch.
So these are relatively large pipes.
Yes.
Okay. So these are not the little, like your air compressor hose.
On the shuttle, they were actually 17 inches. So
for fueling the vehicle.
Yeah.
Loaded. Wow.
Yeah. So these are a little bit smaller than that, but anyways, so that went really well. About the only thing that didn't go well on that, and it was NASA does these briefings, right? They do press briefings usually after a major event like this, and they were happy to do a press briefing. So the business end of the wet dress rehearsal was Thursday afternoon and evening, and I followed along as best I could online. Friday morning, after the successful wet dress rehearsal, they had a press briefing, and I do this. I'm America's favorite rocket scientist. I do this on Buffnagel. I don't do this for a living. This is one of my retirement gigs.
Yes,
and
we appreciate that.
I do it for the simple joy of getting to have these conversations.
Yes.
And to spread my understanding to the listeners, but attending these press briefings are paid and online sort of press folks, and not one, not two, but three on three separate occasions, questions in the press briefing, where the press get to ask questions. They mentioned how frustrating it was that they couldn't get information out of NASA's communication department. And I have spoke previously on the Buff about my frustrations with the NASA communication department of today, of the present, compared to the public affairs office, NASA public affairs office back in the Apollo days. The current NASA communication department does not have the right stuff, in my opinion. And it's just quite frustrating, because watching the wet dress rehearsal on NASA's official YouTube channel, we had images, we had video feed, no audio. And every now and then they would put a little scrolling notice across the bottom. Those horrible crawls that go from right to left, and they make you dizzy after a while if you watch it for too long. At least they slowed this one down from the Artemis I, and they weren't just scrolling it continuously. It would come on and then go off for a while, so you could get a screen that didn't have this motion on it.
But there was nobody. There was no play-by-play taking place.
There was, the very least they could have done was put the countdown, the primary countdown channel, where the folks doing the work, they could have put that on, but they didn't. Okay. And there were no talking heads, which thank goodness, because their talking heads these days are terrible. They don't understand what they're talking about. It's quite frustrating to someone who does. I mean, I worked on console at the Space Center, at the Launch Control Center, on the shuttle. I didn't work an actual launch countdown, but I worked tests, where we were testing the vehicle, and to not be able to listen in is quite frustrating. And I also listened to one of my favorite YouTube folks who covers this, Philip Sloss, also in a post briefing video, expressed his absolute frustration at exactly the same things I'm complaining about. And with the exception of that, the wet dress rehearsal 2 went really well.
Right.
And the reason why it concerns me at all and why I'm spending any time on it is just that it makes me wonder how they're going to cover the actual launch.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I don't hold out much hope.
Well, there's like when you're doing a wet dress rehearsal, there's not a lot of risk there, right? I mean, if it goes, things start going south, you just turn it off, right? I mean,
you would
a procedure
think this would be a perfect opportunity for the NASA Communication Department to practice their part in this.
Yeah.
And yet,
okay.
Anyways, all right, enough on that.
So wait, let me see. I want to summarize. I got to summarize here. Okay. So back in the day, right near our last episode, they tried the wet dress rehearsal. That didn't go as they planned. They did some fixes for it. They did a second wet dress rehearsal. Things did better on the second wet dress rehearsal, with one exception.
Yes, with the one exception I complained about.
Yep.
And during the press briefing on Friday, they even talked about the fact that they were working towards the March 6th opening of the launch window for this series, the series of launch dates that they have in May or in March. So they were working towards that. They didn't commit to March 6th being the launch date, but they said that's the date they're working towards. And if everything they had to do in the next couple of weeks went well, they were planning to go at the opening of the window. And then the very next day.
Meanwhile,
I was busy all day on Saturday doing fun things in my model railroading hobby.
Sure.
And I got home and decided to check, to see how things were going. And I started reading about, I started reading about potential rollback of the vehicle.
Rollback. And okay, so rollback means
the like
you
in
roll
Apollo,
the rocket back into the big building.
Yes, like in Apollo, there's a mobile launch platform with the launch umbilical tower on it, and the rocket sits on top of that, the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft, and the vehicle gets assembled and put together in the vehicle assembly building, which is the same building they used to build up the Apollo launch vehicles, and also the same building they used to build up the shuttles before rolling them to the launch pad as well. And then they roll this crawler thing underneath the launch umbilical tower, which incredibly lifts the whole multi-million pound launch pad, launch tower, and rocket up just enough to clear the bolts that hold it in place, and then rolls that thing out to the launch pad, 3.5 or 4 miles, whatever it is, to pad 39B, and then sets it down on posts, with the bolts lined up just right.
So that's roll out, right? That's roll out.
That's roll out. Well, and so sometimes you have to roll back to the pad.
Okay.
And this gets to get into why, apparently Friday evening, as they were doing routine work, they were working on pressurizing the upper stage with helium, which is a nice material that they use to pressurize the tanks and the plumbing between the propellant tanks and the engines to keep things inert. Okay. Right. So, and they had a problem doing that. And apparently some folks had a very long night. They were up all night trying to get it to work. And so Saturday, and this is another commentary. I can't avoid another commentary on the National Communications, because the new NASA administrator, Jared Isaacman, he posted a couple posts on social media which had more details in them than the post that the NASA Communications Organization posted on the official NASA website.
Okay.
And I just cannot understand why this is so. But having put that aside, I was able to find that post with lots of information in it. And basically, it's a problem. It apparently is a problem similar to a problem they noticed on the Artemis I upper stage vehicle. They thought they had corrected that. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
And it's either a similar or it could potentially be a different problem. But the problem is out at the launch pad, they do not have the access they need to get into the part of the upper stage that they need to get into to troubleshoot and potentially fix this problem. Or if it's on the ground side, they don't have the access there. So they have to take the whole vehicle and the whole launch pad and roll it the 4 miles back to the vehicle assembly building, where they do have all the access platforms to do this work. And you ask yourself, why is this?
That's exactly what I was
probably asking yourself.
Exactly what I'm thinking.
Why is this so? And so I have to contrast this with both the shuttle and the Apollo, because shuttle, back in the Apollo days, when this launch complex and this method of doing a big rocket by building it in the vehicle assembly building and rolling it out to the launch pad, which was done in order to allow them to have a higher launch cadence, which ironically they never ended up using. But when they first started designing the whole launch complex, they thought they would need a very high launch cadence, and they never ended up launching that rapidly. So they had a similar launch platform and launch umbilical tower, and they would roll that out to the launch pad. But then they had a mobile service structure, which they could then roll to the launch pad, which then had the work platforms that could surround the Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft, so they could gain access to anywhere they needed to.
And they don't have that for the SLS Orion?
They had something like that for shuttle. It was called the rotating service structure. It was actually built into the pad, and it rotated around and surrounded the shuttle orbiter and provided access to places that the launch tower did not provide access to.
So we should think of this thing as like, well, for lack of a better term, as scaffolding that allows you to get where you need to go.
It's basically scaffolding that has platforms on it, and it was something they could roll into place and then roll back to get out of the way for launch. And this is not something they have for this SLS Space Launch System, and the reasons for it are long and complicated, and they involve trying to do things on the cheap, and it's a trade-off between things going really well and you don't need it, so you avoid that expense, and things not going well and you have to accept delays in launch of potentially several months. And what we're looking at now is, after on Thursday talking about March 6th being a potential launch date if everything went well, everything didn't go well, and now the March launch window is completely off the table, and they are going to be hustling to be able to launch in April.
And so there's a launch window in April coming up.
Late April? There is a series of launch in April, starting April 1st, April 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. Those dates are available, and they're working to try and get this work all done, get rolled back to the vehicle assembly building, get the problem addressed and corrected and tested, roll it back out to the launch pad do whatever retesting they have to do, since they broke all the connections at the launch pad in order to come back, and then get in a stance where they're ready to launch again.
Wow.
There's going to be a press briefing sometime early this coming week. The plan for rollout is this coming Tuesday, the day this is
For roll out or roll
to roll back. To roll back.
Roll back. Okay.
This coming Tuesday, February 24th. That's the plan for rolling back to the vehicle assembly building, and then that'll start. The work once they get back. It'll take about a day to get back, and it might take another day or two to get all the platforms in place, and then they can start the work and hopefully get it done quickly and get back out to the pad in time to make the April windows.
So they know. Let me rephrase this. They think they know what the issue is and what the work that they need to do is, or is there still investigation?
They still need to do investigation, which they can't even do until they get back there. So it could be there are a number of things. It could be, they have a fault tree that they're going to start working once they get access, and then see where that leads.
Wow.
So, so that's where Artemis II stands. Earliest we're looking at is April 1st, which is the opening of the April launch windows.
So, okay, all right. So the question I think that keeps coming through my head, and probably through other people's, is we know this is rocket science, so it's hard. This is a hard thing to do, but is much of it cost cutting kinds of things. Like, obviously if they don't have the structure to do the work out on the pad, that's, you can point to that as a cost cutting thing. But is it that decisions were made a long time ago that are still sticking around and getting in the craw, or what?
It's a number of things. It's in the time we have left, which we also need to talk about the Starliner update that happened also on Thursday. They're well written. There's even a really good article in Ars Technica about by Eric Berger, another favorite author of mine, that has covered all the problems with the Space Launch System rocket, and there are good summaries of all the reasons why it is what it is, and NASA is trying to make the best of it. And rather than try and cover all that and give it short shrift, maybe we can provide some links.
Sure. Okay. All right. Now, you talked about a Starliner update, and tell us what the Starliner is, what it's been doing, and why this matters.
Meanwhile, while the wet dress rehearsal was going on Thursday, getting into the business end and fueling, loading propellants onto the vehicle, the new NASA administrator, Jared Isaacman, and his associate administrator had a press conference. The press conference was about Starliner, the one of the two spacecraft that NASA had contracted to take astronauts up to the International Space Station. And you may recall all the drama in the summer of 2024, where the two NASA astronauts that went up on the crewed flight test of the Starliner were, quote, stranded.
They're going to get stuck up there, right?
On the space station. Well, the press...
Really? The press
really over-exaggerated the stranded part when the actual really scary part was before they got to the space station. And reading this, so the NASA administrator released a really incredible report. He sent a letter to the NASA employees talking about this before he had the press briefing, and he at concurrent with the press briefing, they then released this investigation report that was commissioned in February of 2025, a year ago. And this investigation panel went through and investigated all the technical reasons and all the other reasons, why this thing happened and how it was handled. And it was stunning. The candor expressed by this new NASA administrator was in contrast to the administrator that was overseeing the agency when this thing happened. It's night and day. It was just amazing. I was so impressed and just amazed at the things he was saying and the things he said needed to happen. He basically said this was really poorly handled. They decided to reclassify that test flight as a type A mishap, which is something that did not happen at the time.
So type A, is that like the biggest?
That's the highest mishap classification that they have, and they classified it as a type A mishap, which has all sorts of implications, including one that should have happened at the time, which was that there would be a program investigation team formed to do the investigation into the mishap and create a report. Now, it turned out that the investigation team was formed, but not until after the administrator that was in charge of the agency at the time left during the presidential transition, and a new temporary administrator was in place who then actually started the ball rolling on the mishap investigation. And so there was a mishap investigation started early in February last year. Their report was finished early this year, and February 6th, I believe, and then only less than 2 weeks after that, they gave Boeing, who built the Starliner, a chance to go through it and redact anything that was in the report that they felt was proprietary, and then the report was released. And so I downloaded that report Thursday evening as soon as I heard about it, and I started reading it, and it's stunning. It is. Some of the conclusions are just remarkable. It goes through the most important point here is that while attempting to dock to the International Space Station, the Starliner lost enough thrusters due to the problems they were having with the thrusters, which they had also had problems on the previous two uncrewed test flights that they still had on this test flight. Those problems caused them to lose 6 degrees of freedom control, which 6 degrees of freedom control in a spacecraft is really important because that's all the degrees of freedom.
That's like up, right? Down, left, right, forward, backward. Is that something essentially
it's
that?
Up, down, left, right, forward, backward. Those are 3. And then the other 3 are pitch, yaw, and roll.
Okay, right. Okay.
And so that's 6. And if you don't have all 6, the rules say that you shouldn't be trying to dock with the International Space Station. You shouldn't come within the keep-out sphere. Okay,
because which you can damage
a couple hundred meters, because the potential to. But here's the problem: they didn't have 6 degrees of freedom control, so that also put them leaving and returning to Earth in jeopardy.
Right.
So the crews on the ground in the control in the control center did an incredible job to recover 4 of the 5. Thrusters, and then the crew was then able to dock with the International Space Station, taking over manual control. But man, that was scary, and it was more scary than NASA had publicly acknowledged in since then, and that's a very serious thing, and so NASA has said, the administrator said two things: they are not going to fly the Starliner again, with or without crew, until all these things are fixed. Because it wasn't just the thrusters; it was also helium leaks, and it was and then they actually flew with this. And this I did not know about. They flew with this knowing it was an issue. They discovered a long-standing, before they launched the crew flight test, they discovered a long-standing design error that reduced the crew module failure tolerance for their control jets down to single point failure. And they decided to fly with that anyway.
So is that a I guess I'm trying to think of how you get there, because I haven't worked on rockets, but I've worked in situations where there's a series of things that have to happen, and there's a protocol for following that, and you have to check all the boxes. And
Yes.
There has to be expert input into all these things. And do people just check the box because it's Friday afternoon, they want to go home, or do they check it because they're scared that if they don't, they get in trouble? Or
there was a whole section on management causes, both management failures in terms of allowing it to fly like this, and there was also management failures in how they managed the flight once it was up there and the problems happened and they got the crew onto the International Space Station. Then there were all kinds of issues with how they tried to decide whether the crew was going to come home in the Starliner or not. And it's just fascinating. As I said,
how long is this
I
report?
stayed up late reading this thing.
You always stay up late,
but I was stayed up extra late for this. And the thing that was amazing to me as I was reading the management parts, it was like, wow, some of this stuff sounds really familiar to me from my days working in the automotive electronics industry in engineering, and how management back then handled issues that involved potential production stops and things like that, similar kinds of pressures, right? And it just was like, oh, this sounds way too familiar. I encourage anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff to go get the report, go find the press release on NASA's website, download the report and take a look at it.
We'll put a link. We're going to put a link in the show notes if we can figure out.
Okay. Yes, we can do that. And so the thing I want to say is the administrator said two things. They're not going to fly until these are fixed. And then the other thing they said is there are going to be personnel changes as a result of what happened and what's in the report.
Wow.
Which needs to happen.
All right. I'm going to ask one thing. We have just a couple minutes here.
Yep.
So these thrusters are the things, there's little, they shoot out little bits of gas and kind of redirect the spacecraft to do all those 6 things that you talked about.
Yes, the 6 degrees of freedom.
And in a very basic sense, they are essentially little spray cans attached to the side of the thing, but something has to push the button on the spray can. So so you said they've eventually got attached doing manual flight. Is normally that run by computers? And if it stops working and they got it working from the ground, how like
quickly I can explain that. Yes. The normal method is computer software controlled, and what happens is they have software that's monitoring the function of the jets and is able to fail out jets if they start behaving incorrectly. There's plenty of reasons for that, because a failed jet could cause bigger problems, and using a failed jet could cause bigger problems. So they're failing out jets. So what happened is they progressively lost up 5 of these control jets, and by the control software, and that's where they paused. Outside the keep out sphere, they paused. They analyzed the problem on the ground, and the ground honestly did a variation of let's turn them off and turn them back on.
We're going to reboot.
And
Wow.
and that worked for 4 of the 5. And 4 of the 5 continued to work until just moments before docking, when one of them went bad again, but they still had enough to continue the docking in those last seconds. So yes, it
Wow. So I guess I'm thinking about that. Is the sensor failing? Is the software not doing what it's supposed to do? Is the communication
the report ended up saying is they never fully root caused the problems that were similarly occurred on the first 2 uncrewed flights. They did not root cause, and they accepted what in the space business is called an unexplained anomaly. They accepted those without root cause, analysis to root cause. And they only started doing some of the analysis after this happened on the crewed flight and the spacecraft was docked at the space station.
Do they know now what was causing that?
They're still working on it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
a year and a half later,
they put people on that to go up there, and put at risk the people on the space station, and people on the ground in case.
And that's why the new NASA administrator reclassified this thing, and he said they are going to implement all of the investigation team's findings, both technical and organizational.
Wow. Okay. Well, good for
which is good news. That's
and this
really
guy
good news.
This guy's name is, you said,
Jared Isaacman.
Jared Isaacman.
Yes.
All right. Wonderful. All right. Well, let's hope that things go well for NASA now coming up. Bob, this is always great, and there's 800 questions that we could go into, but we're going to save that for the post-production meeting that we'll have, I'm sure, for the next hour or so.
As always.
The rest of you, you know what to do. Remember to seek the good, live virtuously, and flourish, and enjoy the adventure of life.
It's going to be a great day.